Subscribe and tap the bell right now, today, before you go. Twice a day, we bring you the real code of the samurai, not paraphrased, never softened. A samurai serving in any real household eventually had to deal with people he couldn't simply walk away from, a difficult lord, a rival retainer, a superior who was wrong and dangerous to correct. Bushido had a great deal to say about exactly this problem, because it understood something most modern advice on the subject of difficult people tends to skate past entirely. You can't always remove yourself from the relationship, and you're rarely entitled to simply retaliate in kind. What the code offered instead was a specific hierarchy of virtues, applied in a deliberate order, for handling exactly the kind of person most of us would honestly rather avoid entirely than ever actually confront. The first instinct Bushido trained a samurai to override was the urge toward simple retaliation, meeting rudeness with rudeness, contempt with contempt. Nitobe's account of politeness makes clear this was never treated as weakness or passivity. He roots the virtue in modesty and complaisance, actuated by respect for others' feelings, expressed outwardly as courtesy and urbanity of manners. Crucially, this respect was never treated as conditional on the other person actually deserving it in that particular moment. A samurai's politeness was a discipline he practiced regardless of how he was being treated, precisely because letting someone else's poor conduct dictate your own response handed them control over something that should have remained entirely yours to govern. That doesn't mean Bushido asked a warrior to simply tolerate mistreatment indefinitely without response. This is where rectitude comes back into the picture, working alongside politeness rather than against it. Nitobe defines rectitude as the power to decide a course of conduct in accordance with reason, without wavering, which means a difficult person genuinely acting wrongly still had to be confronted, corrected, or in extreme cases opposed. The discipline wasn't in avoiding conflict altogether. It was in making sure the response came from a reasoned decision about what was actually right, rather than from wounded pride reacting in the heat of the moment. Ōishi Kurenasoke, who led the 47 Rōnin in the plot we've covered in a previous video, offers the clearest large-scale example of exactly this discipline under real pressure. For nearly 2 years, he had to tolerate open contempt from people who genuinely believed he'd abandoned all honor, insults, public humiliation, even a stranger spitting on him in the open street. He said nothing at all in his own defense, not because he privately agreed with their harsh judgment of him, but because reacting to it visibly would have unraveled a plan built entirely on being underestimated. That's politeness and rectitude working together at their most extreme, enduring real, undeserved contempt without retaliating, while simultaneously holding, privately and without wavering, to a course of action that would eventually prove every one of those insults wrong. Benevolence adds a further layer that's easy to overlook when dealing with someone genuinely difficult. Nitobe describes it as love, magnanimity, affection for others, sympathy and pity, a virtue the strongest members of the samurai class were expected to extend especially toward those without the standing to defend themselves. Applied to a difficult person, this doesn't mean excusing bad behavior. It means recognizing that a person acting from insecurity, fear, or genuine incompetence is often a different problem than a person acting from actual malice, and Bushido expected a samurai to correctly distinguish between the two before deciding how to respond. Confronting malice required courage and rectitude in their fullest form. Confronting someone acting out of weakness sometimes called for exactly the patience and restraint Benevolence describes instead. It's worth being honest that this framework doesn't produce a quick or particularly satisfying result in the moment. Most modern advice about difficult people promises some version of relief close at hand, a clever comeback, a boundary that instantly resolves the friction, a way to feel better about the interaction by the time it's over. Bushido offers none of that. Its version of handling a difficult person is slower, less emotionally satisfying in the short term, and considerably harder to execute consistently, because it requires holding two things at once that most people default to trading off against each other: genuine respect towards someone who may not have earned it in that particular moment, and a private, unwavering clarity about what you actually intend to do about the situation regardless. What ties all of this together is self-control, the virtue Nitobe places last precisely because it has to hold underneath every other response a samurai chooses to make. A warrior could correctly identify a difficult person as genuinely malicious, correctly decide that confrontation was warranted under rectitude, and still fail completely if his own emotional reaction took over the moment he actually opened his mouth. This is why Bushido treated composure as a prerequisite for every other virtue on the list, not a separate skill practice in isolation. Politeness without self-control collapses into gritted teeth suppression that eventually snaps, and rectitude without it turns a reasoned confrontation into an emotional outburst that undermines the very case being made. Applied practically, this gives a specific sequence worth following the next time you're dealing with someone genuinely difficult. First, identify honestly which of the two you're actually dealing with, malice or simple weakness, the distinction benevolence demands you make before reacting at all. Second, decide, using reason rather than wounded pride, whether the situation actually calls for confrontation or simply requires you to hold your position without escalating, the discipline rectitude insists on. Third, whatever you decide, carry it out with the composure self-control requires, since an otherwise correct response delivered without control undoes most of its own value. It's also worth noticing what this framework deliberately doesn't ask for. It doesn't ask you to like the difficult person, pretend the friction isn't real, or perform a forgiveness you don't actually feel. Nitobe's Bushido was never built around pleasant feelings toward everyone you encounter. It was built around disciplined conduct regardless of what you happen to feel toward the person in front of you. That distinction matters, because a great deal of modern advice on this subject quietly conflates the two, asking you to manufacture warmth you don't have as a precondition for behaving well. Bushido asked for the behavior directly, and treated whatever you actually felt underneath it as a separate, private matter entirely your own to manage. None of this makes a difficult person easier to be around. What it offers instead is the exact same thing it offered Ōishi across 2 full years of calculated public silence, the ability to genuinely choose your own response on purpose, rather than simply reacting to whatever emotion the other person happens to successfully provoke in you. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Twice a day, we bring you Bushido straight from the source. The real words of the man who wrote the code down, and the real warriors who lived it.